The coronet hit the marble floor with a sound like a struck coin, clear and ringing, and every head in the anteroom turned. Every head except hers. Cecily Marsh had been making her way toward the servants' corridor for the better part of 10 minutes, moving along the wall as she had learned to move through rooms like this one. Without friction, without eye contact, without the particular quality of presence that invited attention. She was dressed in dove gray. She carried a small work bag. She was no one, and she had arranged herself carefully to confirm that fact. The December reception at Carlton House was still in full murmur beyond the gilt doors, and she had only to reach the passage at the far end, and she would be gone, and Lady Pelham's hem would be mended, and Cecily would be 2 shillings closer to the month's rent, and no one in this building would ever know she had been here. Then the coronet struck the floor, and she stopped. It lay 3 feet from her. Where it had slipped from the edge of a side table no one had thought to guard. Silver, set with garnets the color of dried blood. The circlet of an earl. She recognized it because she had spent 4 years mending fine things for people who owned fine things. And she knew what garnet looked like against polished silver. And she knew that an earl's coronet placed on a side table during a presentation ceremony meant an earl was somewhere in this room. She bent and picked it up. She did not think about it. That was the truth she could not have explained afterward, not even to herself. The coronet was on the floor, and then it was in her hands, and then she was turning. And the earl was already moving toward her, and the distance between them closed in 3 strides. He was tall. He wore a navy tailcoat with brass buttons and a white cravat tied with the particular carelessness of a man who had tied it himself rather than permitted a valet to do it. His hair was dark brown, close-cropped, and his face was the kind of face that had not been arranged for this moment or for any other, strong-nosed and set-jawed, with deep-set eyes the color of amber at the bottom of a glass. He looked at the coronet she held, and then he looked at her. And for 3 seconds he did not move. She held the coronet out to him. He took it. Their fingers did not touch. His eyes did not leave her face. She turned and walked away. She did not run. Running would have drawn more notice than her plain gown and her stillness already had. She walked at the same measured pace she always kept in rooms like this one. And she found the servants' corridor. And she went through it. And she did not look back. And the December cold outside the tradesman's entrance received her without comment. And she was gone. She did not give him her name because he had not asked for it. She would not have given it if he had, because it had no value here. And she did not think again about the color of his eyes until she was 3 streets away. And by then the thought could do nothing to her that mattered. That was the 5th of December. Cecily Marsh had been living in a single hired room above a chandler's shop in St. Giles since the spring, having moved from a slightly larger hired room above a draper's when the draper raised his rate at Michaelmas. The room was cold in the mornings because the window faced north, and the chimney that served her grate also served the rooms on either side, and the result was a warmth that was theoretical more than actual until well past 10 o'clock. She had learned to work in her cloak until the fire took hold, and she had learned not to mind. Her work was fine work, and she was very good at it. Lace, principally. The repair of Brussels point and Honiton, the reattachment of torn edging on evening gloves, the careful restoration of embroidered muslin sleeves that had been caught on something sharp at a ball and could not be replaced in time for the next one. The ladies who sent her work rarely knew her name. They knew her through their housekeepers or their ladies' maids, who described her as the lace woman in St. Giles, or the mending woman Lady Harwood uses, or that reliable creature who does not gossip. She had spent 4 years becoming a reliable creature who does not gossip, and she was, by now, extremely reliable, and she did not gossip about anything. Her father, Thomas Marsh, had been a clockmaker of the minor gentleman variety, a man who owned books, who had a subscription to a lending library, who had educated his daughter in French and in music, and in the quiet maintenance of dignity, regardless of circumstance. He had also backed a venture in 1807 that a man named Crawford had presented to him as a certainty, and the venture had not been a certainty, and by 1811 Thomas Marsh had no money and a good deal of debt, and in 1812 he died of the combined weight of shame and a chest ailment that might have been survivable in a warmer house. Cecily had been 19 years old. She had sold what could be sold. She had paid what could be paid. She had kept her father's small collection of books, because no one offered her enough for them, and because the French dictionary still had his handwriting in the margins. She had written to a cousin in Derbyshire who had not replied, and to a former neighbor who had replied with sympathy, and a loan she had repaid within the year, and a recommendation to a housekeeper who needed reliable lacework done. And she had gone to work. That was the shape of her life. It was not a story she told because no one asked, and it was not a grievance she carried, because grief without an audience eventually settles into something quieter, something that lives in the hands and in the careful attention one pays to small things that can be made right. Cecily could not give her father his venture back. She could repair lace. So she repaired lace, and she kept her room, and she owed nothing to anyone. And when Lady Pelham's maid came in November to hire her for an evening's work at Carlton House, Cecily had agreed, because 2 shillings was 2 shillings, and because the hem would have been visible to everyone at the reception if she had refused. She had not expected the Earl. She had not expected 3 seconds of eye contact that she could still, 3 weeks later, feel at the back of her throat like something she had nearly said. It was the day after Christmas when she first heard the word that the Earl of Varley had been asking questions. She heard it from Mrs. Downey, the draper's wife, who had heard it from the milliner 3 streets over, who had it from a footman whose cousin served at Varley House. The Earl, it was said, had been making discreet inquiries about a young woman in a gray gown who had retrieved his coronet at the Carlton House reception on the 5th of December, and then disappeared. Cecily sat very still when she heard this, and then she went back to her work. And she did not say anything at all. She heard, second-hand, that Lady Constance Vane, who had managed the Earl's social calendar since his wife's death, and who was understood by most of London to be selecting his next match from among a very small and appropriate field, had described the woman in the gray gown to her niece, Arabella Thornton, with a particular succinctness. Some creature from the back of the crowd, she had said. A charity case, by the look of her. No doubt someone's indigent relation allowed in as a kindness. The thing was nothing. Cecily thought about that word. Nothing. And then she put it away with all the other words she had been given over the years for what she was. And she went back to her work. He found her on the 3rd of January at Lady Pelham's house in Grosvenor Street. She had come to deliver a repaired evening glove. She had been admitted to the tradesman's entrance and was standing in the hall while the housekeeper went to fetch her payment. And she had been standing there for perhaps 4 minutes when the door at the far end of the hall opened, and the Earl of Varley walked through it. He was not supposed to be there. Lady Pelham was his cousin by marriage, but that was not a connection that typically produced uninvited morning calls, and Cecily understood in the moment she saw him that his presence was not a coincidence. He stopped when he saw her. She did not move. She was holding the glove box under one arm, and she did not shift it. And she did not look away, because looking away would have been a kind of flinching that her father had raised her not to do. Miss Marsh, he said. She had not told him her name. She waited. I had some difficulty, he said, finding you. He said it without apology and without accusation, in a level voice that belonged to a man who chose his words one at a time. I was not given your name at Carlton House. I have been asking. I know, she said. I heard that you were asking. A pause. Something shifted in the set of his jaw. Not a great shift, barely legible. And you did not come forward. No, she said. I did not think it was necessary. I wanted to thank you. You have thanked me, she said. Good morning, my lord. She did not leave because the housekeeper had not yet returned with her payment, and walking out without it would have been foolish. And she was not foolish. She stood where she was, and the Earl of Varley stood where he was. And the silence between them was the kind that had weight, the kind that asked a question without phrasing one. What you did, he said at last, was not a small thing. I picked up something that had fallen, she said. It was the small thing. The coronet is the large thing, and it is yours. He looked at her for a moment with those amber-brown eyes, and she was aware, against her better judgment, of the specific quality of his attention. Not the fleeting inspection of a man cataloging an unfamiliar face, but the stilled focus of a man who had decided something was worth looking at carefully. She did not permit herself to feel anything about that. If you find yourself wondering, as she stood there in Lady Pelham's hall in January cold, whether quiet dignity is ever witnessed by someone whose witnessing matters, then stay a little longer. This story is only beginning. Lady Pelham's housekeeper returned with the payment, and Cecily thanked her and left. And the Earl of Varley did not follow her into the street, and she was grateful for that small mercy. She was less grateful, over the following week, for the quality of her own memory. Mrs. Agnes Pell was the housekeeper at Varley House, and she was also, as Cecily had known since she was 12 years old, the woman who had employed Cecily's mother for 6 months of laundry work in the difficult year after Cecily's mother took ill, and before she recovered enough to return to her own small household. Cecily had not thought of Agnes Pell in years, had not thought of the connection as a connection at all, because it was not a connection, but a memory of a different life. She thought of it now because Agnes arrived at her room in St. Giles on the 7th of January with a small amount of money in a sealed envelope and an explanation that the Earl had reviewed the household accounts from the previous autumn and found that a bill for lace repair sent in October had been acknowledged but not paid. He found it himself, Agnes said, in a tone that suggested she was choosing her words with care. He went through the accounts himself. He does that. Cecily looked at the envelope. The bill had been for 12 shillings. The amount inside was 12 shillings and 6, and when she counted it out, she understood the extra 6pence as an apology from someone who did not know how to apologize, offered at a remove, through a mechanism that preserved her dignity by calling it arithmetic. She did not say this to Agnes. She said that she was grateful and that she would send a receipt. Agnes looked at her for a moment with an expression Cecily could not fully interpret, and then she said that he was a good man and that he had had a difficult 3 years. Cecily said nothing. His wife, Agnes said. She died in the autumn of 1810. The child as well. He was not there when it happened. A pause. He has not forgiven himself for that. He works. He goes through accounts at midnight. He does not sleep very much. Cecily looked at the 12 shillings and 6 on the table. I am sorry for his loss, she said, because she was. Agnes left, and Cecily sat for a long time in her cold room with the coins in a small pile, and the chandler's smell coming up through the floor. and the French dictionary on the shelf with her father's handwriting in the margins, and she thought about a man sitting up past midnight going through household accounts, because that was the only way he could make the small things right when the large things were irreversible. She understood that better than she could have explained. She did not let herself understand it too deeply, because she had been in enough rooms where she was the charity case, the indigent relation, the nobody from the back of the crowd, and she knew that a man of the Earl's station going through accounts at midnight was not the same thing as a man of the Earl's station choosing a woman with 12 shillings and 6 to her name. She was not naive. She was very far from naive. It was at Lady Pelham's house again, the following week, that he came to call a second time, and this time she was in the upstairs sitting room, brought there at Lady Pelham's insistence for tea, because Lady Pelham had the occasional democratic impulse that produced discomfort in everyone. He had not been announced when he arrived. He had been shown to the sitting room by a young footman who had mistaken his purpose, and in the corridor outside the half-open door he had stopped, because inside the room Cecily was reading aloud to Lady Pelham's youngest granddaughter, a child of 6 or 7, who had apparently followed the housekeeper upstairs and refused to be returned. The girl was sitting on a stool at Cecily's feet, and Cecily was reading from a small book about a hedgehog who could not find his way home in the dark, and she was reading it with the same careful attention she gave to everything, not performing warmth, but simply present in it. And the child was entirely still and watching her with the particular gravity of a child who has decided that a person is trustworthy. He stood in the corridor and did not go in. And he stood there longer than he had any practical reason to. And then the footman appeared again and announced him. And the moment was over. And Cecily looked up and met his eyes with no particular expression. Lord Varley arrived mid-visit, and Lady Pelham received him with the vague warmth of a woman who had not expected him, but was pleased to demonstrate she could entertain 2 social registers simultaneously. He sat across from Cecily. Lady Pelham talked about the winter season. He answered when addressed and watched Cecily when he was not. She was aware of his watching. She kept her hand still on her lap, which required more effort than it should have. "I owe you an explanation, I think," the Earl said, when Lady Pelham had gone to instruct a footman about a tray. "For the accounts." "You owe me nothing," Cecily said. "An outstanding bill was settled. That is commerce, not obligation." "I would like," he said. And then he stopped, which was the most surprising thing she had heard a man of his station do in recent memory. He was not a man who stopped mid-sentence. She understood that, though she had only met him twice. "My lord," she said carefully. "I would like," he said again, "to tell you about my wife, if you will permit it." She did not know what to say to that. She said nothing. He told her in brief, flat sentences. The way a man recounts something he has recounted many times in his own head. Dorothea had been 22. The birth came 6 weeks early. He had been in London. By the time he reached the country, the house was quiet in the wrong way, and Agnes had met him at the door, and he had known before she spoke. He had sat in the hall for a long time, and then he had gone in. And he had not been able to make any of it different. And he had not been the same since. "I do not tell you this," he said, "so that you will think better of me. I tell you because I have been going through accounts at midnight, trying to locate the precise moment I failed her, and I cannot find it. And it is possible the failure is simply that I am the sort of man who is always somewhere else when it matters most." The fire was low. His hands on his knees were very still. "You were not somewhere else on the 5th of December, she said. He looked at her. "You were in the room," she said. "You were there." Something moved through his face. Not quickly. More the way light moves through water when a cloud passes overhead. A shift, a change. And then something that was not quite an expression, but was close to one. He looked at his hands. "Miss Marsh," he said, "I have received an obligation from my late wife's family. Lady Constance Vane manages my household social affairs, and she has made clear to me and to half of London that I am to present myself at the Vane Winter Assembly on the 22nd, and that I am expected to dance with Miss Arabella Thornton more than once." A pause. "I am telling you this because I have not decided how to proceed with it." Cecily said nothing, because nothing she could say would be appropriate. "Mrs. Pell," he said, "has mentioned that she would benefit from a companion's company at the assembly, if you were willing." She understood what he was offering, and she understood its limitations, and she understood that she should say no. She said she would think about it. She thought about it for 2 days, and then she wrote to Agnes, and said she would come. The Vane Winter Assembly was held at Lady Constance's house in Portman Square, and it was a fine house with many candles and a good deal of floral arrangement and the particular quality of density that comes from a woman who has spent decades curating a guest list as a social instrument. Cecily arrived with Agnes just after 9 and was given no particular notice, which was exactly what she wanted. She noticed Lord Varley the moment she entered, because he was standing at the far end of the room in conversation with a white-haired peer she did not recognize, and he was the kind of man a room arranged itself slightly around without his intending it. She noticed him, and then she looked away, which took more deliberate effort than she liked. Miss Thornton was present. She was 22. She wore rose silk. She had a polished blonde beauty and an ease of movement that came from having been raised in rooms exactly like this one. She was not unkind, as far as Cecily could observe. She was simply completely correct. With the correct dress, the correct connections, the correct family, the correct expectations. She was standing at Lady Constance's side with the particular calm of a woman who has been told her entire life that she is the right answer. Cecily drank her tea near the wall and watched the room and told herself this was fine. This was the shape of things. She had known the shape of things for 4 years. It was Lord Pelham who provided the second voicing. He was standing with 2 other gentlemen perhaps 10 feet from where Cecily stood, and he said, in the carrying way of a man accustomed to being listened to, that he had heard Varley had been peculiar since December, and that it had something to do with a woman at Carlton House, and that the woman in question was a Marsh, the clockmaker's girl. No name and no family, and no business being at Carlton House at all, and that Lady Constance had the right of it in ignoring the whole business. Cecily heard every word. She set her cup down and looked at the fireplace, and she thought about her father's handwriting in the margins of the French dictionary, and she thought about 12 shillings and 6 in a sealed envelope, and she thought about a man sitting up at midnight going through accounts, and she thought, with a cold clarity, that she had known this. She had known exactly what she was walking into when she agreed to come. Lady Constance made her announcement at 10:30. She stood at the center of the room and said, with the authority of a woman who had been managing social weather for 30 years, that she was very pleased to tell her guests that Lord Varley had indicated his intention to present Miss Thornton with an offer of marriage before the new year, and that she expected the formal announcement at her next assembly, and that she trusted her friends would share in her great happiness at the prospect. The room applauded. Lord Varley, across the room, did not applaud. He stood very still, and his face was the face of a man who has heard a sentence that has outpaced his own intentions. But Cecily could not be certain of that, because she was not certain of anything about him except that he had amber-brown eyes, and that he had once told her things a man did not need to tell a mending woman, and that none of that was sufficient. She found Agnes and said she was tired and would take her leave. Agnes looked at her, and then looked at the room, and did not say anything, except that she would get their cloaks. It was while Cecily was waiting near the hall that Mrs. Fenwick appeared. She was a thin woman of about 50. Lady Constance's companion, who had the unhappy demeanor of a person who enjoys delivering messages she knows will cause discomfort. "Lady Vane asked me to convey to you," she said in a low, formal voice, "that your presence at this assembly was noted and was considered something of a presumption. She says that you are a person of no account and no name, and that you might benefit from reflecting on the distinction between what one has been permitted and what one is entitled to expect." Cecily looked at her for a moment. "I was invited," she said, "by Mrs. Pell." "Mrs. Pell," Mrs. Fenwick said, "is a housekeeper." She paused, as if she believed this completed the thought. Agnes arrived with the cloaks. Cecily took hers and put it on, and she stood in the hall of Lady Constance's house in Portman Square, and she thought about slipping away, which was what she did, which was what she had always done, which was the thing she was very good at, vanishing from rooms where she was not wanted before anyone had the difficulty of asking her to leave. She thought about the coronet on the marble floor. She thought about picking it up without thinking. She thought about what it would mean to put herself down and walk away. Agnes was watching her. The cloaks were on. The door to the reception room was 10 feet away. Cecily removed her cloak. She handed it back to Agnes, who received it without a word, and with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for something, and had just recognized it arriving. Cecily went back into the room. She did not go far. She stood near the wall where she had been standing before, and she waited. And she was visible. And she did not arrange herself to be invisible. Which was the thing. The specific and difficult thing. Because she had been arranging herself to be invisible for 4 years, and the arrangement was very practiced, and abandoning it in a room full of people who had been told she was a person of no account required something she did not have a good name for. She had spent enough of her life slipping away before anyone knew her name. Not tonight. She heard because the room had the particular acoustics of high ceilings and many voices carrying farther than they should. Lady Constance speaking to Miss Thornton near the window. She heard the words, "the coronet," and she heard the words, "some creature who touched it," and she heard Lady Constance's voice lighten with something between amusement and satisfaction as she said that he had been peculiar since December over a woman with no name and no family, but that the peculiarity would pass once the engagement was settled. The thing will pass. Cecily looked at the fire. She heard someone cross the room. She did not look up immediately, because she was not sure she was ready to. But she knew from the quality of the sudden stillness around her that the someone was not a footman. And when she did look up, Lord Varley was 3 feet away. And he was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Something that was not composed and was not performed, and that she did not have a name for. "You came back," he said, "into the room. You were leaving, and you came back." "Yes," she said. "Why?" She thought about that for a moment, honestly. The way she thought about things that were going to cost her something. "Because I picked up a coronet once," she said, without thinking. "And I have spent too much of my life doing things without thinking in the wrong direction, disappearing without thinking. Not this time." He looked at her. The fire was very warm at her side, and the room was very loud, and Lady Constance had gone still at her periphery in the way of a woman who has realized something is happening that she did not arrange. "Miss Marsh," he said. And his voice was level, but not cold, not the controlled level of his early sentences, something warmer in the grain of it. "I did not instruct Constance to make any announcement tonight. That announcement was not mine." She waited. "I have been trying," he said, "since January, to think of a correct way to tell you that the 5 minutes in Lady Pelham's hall, and the hour in her sitting room, and the morning I spent going through household accounts looking for your name in the ledgers have been the most awake I have felt in 3 years. And I have not found a correct way, because there is not one. There is only the truth, which is that I should like very much for you not to leave this room again without telling me whether there is any hope at all. Cecily was aware that the room had gotten quieter, the way rooms do when something is happening that everyone wants to hear. People will say you have lost your senses, she said. Let them, he said. Lady Vane will be very angry. She is already very angry, he said. It does not seem to be stopping me. Lady Constance appeared at his shoulder. She was a woman of great composure and great social confidence, and she deployed both now. Edmund, she said, her voice quiet enough to be private and loud enough to be heard. This is not the occasion for whatever you are imagining. Miss Thornton is waiting. I really must insist. He turned to face her. He said it without raising his voice, without any of the machinery of volume or display. Miss Marsh is the only woman in this room I choose. 10 words. They were not loud. They landed in the room the way the coronet had landed on the marble floor at Carlton House, clear and ringing and impossible to ignore. Lady Constance's fan stopped moving. Miss Thornton across the room went very still, and then something in her face shifted. Something that was not humiliation, but was closer to recognition. The expression of a woman who has understood that a script she had been given has ended, and who is not entirely certain the script was one she had written herself. The white-haired peer said something very quietly to the man beside him. Edmund Ashbourne, Earl of Varley, turned back to Cecily. Mr. Clement Baxter appeared at the edge of the gathering, and he had the look of a man who had arrived precisely when he was supposed to arrive, which was because he had been summoned precisely for this moment. He was a small, neat man with papers under his arm, and he was Edmund's solicitor. And he said to Cecily, in the formal way of a man completing a thing, that the deed to the Marsh cottage in Hertfordshire had been redrawn in the name of Miss Cecily, and that he was prepared to transfer possession at her convenience. She heard her own name in the solicitor's mouth. Formal and complete, the name her father had given her. She looked at Edmund. He leaned slightly closer, so that only she could hear. The cottage was a Varley estate property, he said. It was your father's before it was mine. It should have been returned years ago. The solicitor simply required instruction. She did not cry. She was her father's daughter, and her father had believed in composure, and she had inherited that from him. Along with the French dictionary, and the debt and the education that had made her capable of repairing lace in a cold room, and still knowing what a coronet was worth. You are a great deal of trouble, my lord, she said. Something happened to his face then. It was not exactly a smile, because she understood he was not, habitually, a man who smiled. But it was the thing that preceded a smile in a man who had forgotten he was capable of one, a loosening, a warmth behind the amber-brown eyes, a quality of light in the deep lines around his mouth. I know, he said. I have been informed of that. Lady Constance did not speak again that evening. She sat in a chair near the fire with the particular rigidity of a woman who has understood that the machinery has not worked as she intended, and she looked at the room, and the room looked at her. And no one said anything cruel, because no one needed to. The correction was complete. She would absorb it, in time, in her own way, because she was not a bad woman. She was a woman whose confidence in the order of things had simply encountered a fact the order could not account for. The assembly continued. The musicians played. Miss Thornton danced with Lord Pelham, who was attentive in the way of a man who has just identified an unexpected opening, and she allowed it with the composure of a woman who has decided to revise her expectations without complaint. Cecily stood near the fire with her cloak still over Agnes's arm, and Edmund stood beside her, and they did not speak very much, because there was not very much that needed saying yet, and because the warmth of the room was enough, and the fire was enough, and the solicitor had said her name, and the Earl had said her name, and that was, for tonight, a sufficient abundance of being known. Spring came slowly that year. The Thames thickened with mud before it cleared. The parks went from bare to tentative to the first reckless green, and the rooms at Varley House, which Cecily first entered in March as a guest, and again in April on a formal occasion, and again in May as something that no longer had a temporary name, grew gradually familiar to her. Agnes showed her the morning room first because it had the best light, and then the library, because she could see that Cecily's eyes went straight to the books, and then the small sitting room at the back of the house that looked out onto the walled garden, which was in the process of being replanted on instructions she learned had come from Edmund himself, who had decided that spring that things could be made to grow again. He was not an easy man. He slept better than he had in 3 years, Agnes reported, with the satisfaction of a woman whose observations on such things were never wrong, but he still went through the household accounts after midnight, and he still had days when the grief was close to the surface, and he moved through the house with that particular careful stillness. On those days, Cecily learned that what he needed was not comfort and not conversation, but the knowledge that someone was in the next room who was not going to leave. She was very good at staying. She had decided to be good at it. The French dictionary, with her father's handwriting in the margins, was on the shelf in the morning room beside 3 volumes of natural history and a worn copy of Pauper that had belonged to Edmund's father. She had put it there in March, and it had remained there, and no one had commented on it. And its presence on the shelf alongside the Varley books was the kind of small fact that was not announced, but that settled. In the library, on the 3rd shelf, at the height of a standing man's reach, Edmund had placed the coronet. Not under glass, not displayed as a relic. Placed there, as a man, places something he wants to be able to see, without it being the first thing a visitor noticed, present and unemphasized, belonging to the room rather than making a demand on it. The silver had been polished. The garnets caught the morning light. She stood before it on a Tuesday in early June in the library, in the warmth, with the sound of the garden coming through the open window, and Agnes somewhere in the house giving instructions to someone. And she thought about the 5th of December, and the marble floor, and 3 seconds of eye contact, and everything that had started from the simple fact that she had picked up something that had fallen because it was the obvious thing to do, the uncomplicated thing, and she had not thought about it, and she had not weighed it, and she had not calculated what it might cost or give her, and she had simply done it and walked away. She had not walked away that night in Portman Square. She heard Edmund in the hall, the sound of his boots on the parquet, a pause, the door. He came to stand beside her. He looked at the coronet on the shelf, and then at her. "You are thinking," he said. "I am," she said. "I do that." "I know," he said. "I have come to rely on it." She looked at the garnets in the morning light, dark red, the color of something warmed through. "A woman with my history," she said, "ought not to be standing in this library." "A woman with your history," he said, "is precisely the person standing in this library. That is not in spite of your history. It is because of it." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the garden was being planted. Someone was whistling, low and unself-conscious. The June light was warm and particular, the kind that did not often come this steadily to London, the kind that made everything it touched look as if it had been placed with care. She reached up and touched the base of the coronet very lightly, one finger along the silver. She had returned it once, in December, in a cold anteroom, to a man she did not know. She was not returning it now. Now it was simply here, in a room that was becoming her room, on a shelf among books that included her father's French dictionary, and the man beside her was Edmund Ashbourne, who had gone through accounts at midnight to find her name, and who had said 10 words in a room full of people and meant each one, and who was looking at her now with the expression of a man who has decided that the world is not as empty as he thought it was. He said her name, not her title, not her family name, her given name, the one her father had chosen for her. Cecily. One word, spoken quietly, with the particular care of a man who has been thinking about the exact sound of a word for 6 months and is using it for the first time. She looked at him. He did not make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches. He simply held out his hand, and she looked at it, and she took it. And the coronet sat on the shelf in the morning light, and was neither fallen nor claimed nor returned, but simply present, as she was present, finally known, finally named, in a room that had begun, in the small, steady way of things that are meant to last, to keep her. If you were here for Cecily's story, thank you for staying until the end. Leave a thought in the comments about the moment that stayed with you longest. She would not mind being seen after all this time.